Hi guys, thank you so much for joining us today. From Hong Kong to Chinese Communist Party's invasion in Australia and around the globe. Thank you so much, Clive, today for joining us today for this interview. Clive is a professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University. He has just published a book called Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world. He's published a book in 2018 about silent invasion, China's influence in Australia, which has sparked quite a lot of discussion at the time. Yep. About your new book, I've noticed that you're facing quite some challenge of releasing the book in Nordic countries. Why is that happening?
Well, the book has already been released in Germany, in German, and it came out in Australia 3 weeks ago. But the big markets are in the United Kingdom and in the United States and Canada, Northern Hemisphere. And one of the groups mentioned in the book and analysed, it's called the 48 Group Club in London, which has a long history of close links to Beijing. We exposed the links of the group and particularly its chairman to the Chinese Communist Party. And they got wind of it from the German edition and sent a letter to the publisher in London threatening legal action unless we changed the book. And so we don't think there's any substance to their claims of defamation. My co-author, Marika Olberg, and I believe that the research is robust and true. And the lawyers for the company have responded accordingly, and the book will be coming out in the next 2 weeks in the United Kingdom and a little bit later in the United States.
Right. Do you think the Chinese Communist Party might be behind it, like trying to force your book not to be published?
Look, I have no evidence for that, but it's worth noticing that the Chinese Communist Party is well known for the use of lawfare, as it's known. That is, the use of laws in countries where the rule of law prevails to try to attack and silence their enemies. But I have no evidence that the 48 Group Club is acting at the behest of Beijing.
Right, okay.
So I would like to ask something about your motivation. So what's your motivation when you first started investigating CCP infiltration in Australia? And when have you actually started to notice about it?
Well, I guess I first started to notice in 2008, although I did not understand what was happening then. And it's when I went to quietly participate in a demonstration supporting Tibetans when the Olympic torch came to Canberra for the Beijing Olympics. Mm-hmm. And I went along and I was just standing there, and suddenly these hundreds of very angry Chinese students turned up waving flags and bullying and intimidating the Tibetan protesters there. And I was it was really quite a frightening event because there were not enough police there, and I thought the Tibetans were going to be severely injured and attacked. And I went away thinking, what happened? What was that? I didn't get it. Where did all these students come from? Why were they so angry? What happened there? We learned subsequently that it was a well-organised counter-protest, organised from the embassy in Canberra, carried out by Chinese students and scholars associations on campuses around Australia, who organised buses and all kinds of logistics to come. It was organised like a military operation. And there were certain patriotic Chinese-Australian businessmen who put up the money and imported various flags and so on. It was only later we learnt that, but it kind of stuck with me. And then in 2016, a lot of stories appeared in the newspapers about how a wealthy businessman, Chinese or Chinese-Australian, had become the biggest financial donors to Australia's political parties.
Yep.
And that they were having an influence over certain key people in the parties, and even looked like some influence over policy and attitudes towards China. So I thought this was a big problem that, really needed investigating. So I decided that I'd write a book about it. That was at the end of 2016. And then my book, Silent Invasion, came out at the end of February 2018, but not without a lot of trouble, it must be said.
That's great. How imminent would you say the threat of Chinese infiltration in Australia is? Like, we've seen they've got a lot of influence in Australia in recent years, but how imminent would that threat be, and Australians should be awake to that threat?
Well, as I showed in Silent Invasion, drawing on the work of a number of really excellent journalists and also a number of really excellent sinologists and experts in Australia and overseas, and I spoke to quite a large number of analysts and experts in China while researching the book, and in Hong Kong, and of course here in Australia. It's a really big problem. CCP influence in Australia is a really big problem. Over the last 20 years, they've gained a great deal of influence in the diaspora, in the Chinese Australian community here in Australia. There are, of course, many Chinese Australians who hate this and are resisting it, but are fearful of retaliation if they speak up. But there are many people within the diaspora, particularly in United Front groups and in the business community, who essentially work more in the interests of Beijing than they do in the interests of Australia, even though they are Australian citizens. So this is a really deep problem. And of course, we see in the business community, Beijing now has some enormously powerful friends and supporters who will publicly come out and back Beijing's position, but more importantly, heavily lobby governments and senior bureaucrats to do everything to keep Beijing happy. And then, of course, we see a lot of influence in universities and in the cultural sphere. So it's really across the board. One phenomenon which is of particular concern in recent times, last 2-3 years, is the policy of the Communist Party policy of what's known as Huareng Kanzhang, which means ethnic Chinese participation in politics. It basically means Beijing encouraging and supporting trusted people to enter into politics in Australia, either to seek political office in local government or state governments or even federal government, or to become advisors in politicians' offices and exert influence and gather information that way. So it's a really big problem in Australia, as it is in many other countries. Canada, for example, arguably it's even worse. But here in Australia, I think there's much greater public awareness, and the federal government seems determined to push back against CCP influence in Australia. But, we have not by any means won the battle, and there is a long way to go.
So actually we are getting more aware of the situation, but then the problem is, how should we actually resist it? What can we do to actually change the current situation?
Well, in a country like Australia, I think the most important thing is to put up barriers to CCP influence and interference. And that takes a number of forms. One, and probably the most important one, is to inform the public about what has been going on. And I think the Australian public has, to a very large degree, woken up to this danger. Of course, when we're informing the public about what's going on, it's very, very important to keep stressing that the problem here is not Chinese people, not China as such. It's the Chinese Communist Party. That's the target of the pushback. The Chinese Communist Party likes to operate in the shadows, and so it's very important to shed light on it so that Australian people can see exactly what's happening, and they can then be alert to resisting it. In addition, a whole lot of new laws and administrative changes are needed, and probably the most important change in Australia was in 2018, the passage through Parliament of the foreign interference legislation, which bans a lot of activity which is United Front activity, that is people in Australia working on behalf of Beijing who secretly try to influence government processes or interfere with the exercise of democratic rights. Now, there's a long way to go there. We see foreign interference defined that way all the time on university campuses, for example, pro-Beijing students shouting down, intimidating pro-Hong Kong activists, for example. And now that, if they're doing that at the behest of the local consulate or MSS offices, then that is foreign interference and it's a crime, and they should be prosecuted and kicked out of the country, basically. I expect that will happen sooner or later. There have been some terrible cases of that. It should not be happening where we should have free speech on Australian campuses. Yeah. But these pro-Beijing elements are trying to close down free speech in Australia. And this is a scandal that we must resist and respond